6 gravediggers. 4 months, all found dead inside perfectly carved graves, as if invisible hands had worked through the night. Their faces? Frozen in a terror so deep that even hardened Civil War veterans looked away, and every single one died at exactly 3:17 a.m. But what no one knew was that in the nights before, strange lights danced between the headstones, and the earth itself seemed to cry. The state of Vermont called them workplace accidents. But the secret records of Dr. Harrison Webb, hidden for more than 80 years, tell a very different story. A story that begins on an autumn night when something ancient awakened beneath St. Margaret's Cemetery and decided to claim a price no one could escape. Dr. Harrison Webb, a Harvard-trained physician who served as the region's coroner, documented evidence that defied every law of medicine and physics he'd been taught. Graves dug with mathematical precision through frozen ground that should have been impenetrable. Men who had worked with superhuman endurance until their hands were worn to bone. Deaths that occurred at exactly 3:17 a.m. with clockwork regularity, as if something was operating on a supernatural schedule that had nothing to do with earthly time. The official state investigation classified these deaths as industrial accidents, but Webb's private journals, hidden for over 80 years and discovered only by chance during a church renovation, tell a very different story. A story of ancient forces awakened by decades of desecration, of spiritual guardians who demanded a terrible price for the violation of sacred ground, and of a community that learned too late that some places should never be disturbed. What you're about to hear challenges everything we think we know about life, death, and the forces that govern the boundary between them. This isn't content for everyone. If you're looking for simple explanations and comfortable answers, you should probably click away now. But if you're ready to confront evidence that there are things in this world beyond human understanding, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because we're going deep into archives that powerful people wanted to stay sealed forever. Before we begin, let us know in the comments what part of the world you're watching from. We're building a global community of people who aren't afraid to ask the questions that others won't dare to voice. The autumn of 1904 settled over Millbrook, Vermont, like a heavy woolen blanket, bringing with it the kind of bone-deep chill that made even the hardiest mountain folk reach for their thickest coats. The maples that dotted the hillsides around this isolated farming community had turned their brilliant reds and golds, creating a postcard-perfect scene that belied the darkness about to unfold. According to the Millbrook Township records, housed in the Vermont State Archives, the town boasted just 847 residents that year, most of them descendants of the original Scottish and Irish settlers who'd carved their homesteads from the unforgiving wilderness nearly a century before. The community centered around a single dirt road that wound its way between weathered farmhouses and stone walls, leading ultimately to the heart of the settlement, St. Margaret's Church and its adjacent cemetery, perched on a gentle rise overlooking the valley below. Ezra Thompson had been digging graves in that cemetery for 23 years, ever since he'd taken over the position from his aging father in the bitter winter of 1881. At 61, Ezra was a man shaped by decades of hard labor and Vermont winters, his hands gnarled like old oak roots, his back permanently bent from countless hours hunched over a spade, his weathered face telling the story of a life spent outdoors in all seasons. The Millbrook Church Registry, preserved in the Rutland County Historical Society, shows that Ezra had dug 312 graves during his tenure, each one meticulously recorded in his careful handwriting, depth, dimensions, soil conditions, and any notable challenges encountered. Folks in town respected Ezra Thompson. He was reliable as sunrise, never missed a burial, never complained about working in rain or snow, and always treated the deceased with the kind of dignity that made grieving families feel their loved ones were in capable, caring hands. His modest white clapboard house sat just a quarter mile from the cemetery, and townspeople often saw his lantern bobbing through the darkness in the early morning hours as he made his way to prepare for the day's solemn duties. The first signs that something wasn't quite right began on October 13, 1904, a date that would later be circled in red ink in Dr. Harrison Webb's private journals, now held in the restricted collection of the Vermont Medical Society archives. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, whose kitchen window provided a clear view of the cemetery, reported to her husband Samuel over breakfast that she'd seen strange lights moving among the headstones around midnight the previous evening. According to her statement, later recorded in the Millbrook Town Council minutes, the lights weren't the steady glow of Ezra's usual lantern, but rather flickering, dancing illuminations that seemed to move independently of any human bearer. Samuel Hartwell, being a practical man who'd served as the town's blacksmith for 30 years, dismissed his wife's concerns as tricks of moonlight and shadow, perhaps reflecting off the polished granite markers that the wealthier families had begun installing in recent years. But Eleanor insisted that these lights were different. They pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, appearing and disappearing in patterns that made no earthly sense, and they were accompanied by sounds she could only describe as digging, but wrong somehow, like the earth itself was crying out. 3 days later, on the morning of October 16th, young Timothy Marsh made the discovery that would shatter Millbrook's peaceful existence forever. The 12-year-old boy had been tasked with delivering fresh milk to the church for the weekly social gathering, when he spotted something that made his blood run cold in his veins. There, in the newest section of the cemetery, lay Ezra Thompson, face down, in a perfectly excavated grave, 6 feet deep, walls straight as a carpenter's line, corners squared with mathematical precision. The boy's screams brought half the town running, including Dr. Harrison Webb, who arrived to find a scene that would haunt his dreams for decades to come. Ezra's body was positioned with his arms stretched toward his spade, which lay just beyond his fingertips, as if he'd been reaching for it at the moment of death, and his face bore an expression of such absolute terror that several witnesses had to turn away. What truly unsettled Dr. Webb, however, wasn't just the body. It was the grave itself, dug with a level of precision that seemed impossible for a man working alone in the darkness. But what they discovered in the following hours would prove that this was only the beginning of something far more sinister than anyone in Millbrook could have possibly imagined. The funeral of Ezra Thompson took place on a grey October morning that seemed to mirror the somber mood that had settled over Millbrook like a shroud. According to the obituary published in the Rutland Herald on October 20th, 1904, the official cause of death was listed as heart failure brought on by exhaustion, a determination that satisfied the county coroner, but left many questions unanswered for those who'd witnessed the scene firsthand. The position of Gravedigger couldn't remain vacant long. Winter was approaching, and the harsh Vermont climate meant that graves needed to be dug before the ground froze solid as iron. Samuel Morrison, a sturdy 43-year-old farmer from the neighboring township of Clearfield, volunteered for the job after hearing about the opening through his brother-in-law. Morrison had experience with hard labor and wasn't superstitious by nature. He scoffed at the whispered rumors about Ezra's death, telling anyone who'd listen that an old man working alone at night was bound to have an accident eventually. The Millbrook Town Council, desperate to maintain normal cemetery operations, hired Morrison on October 22nd, just 6 days after Ezra's burial. Samuel Morrison brought a different approach to the gravedigger position, one that seemed to promise a return to normalcy for the shaken community. Unlike the solitary Ezra, who'd preferred to work in the pre-dawn darkness, Morrison insisted on digging graves during daylight hours whenever possible, and he made a point of chatting with anyone who passed by the cemetery. His wife Martha later told investigators, in a statement preserved in the Vermont State Police files, that Samuel had laughed off the locals' warnings about strange happenings in the cemetery, declaring that hard work and common sense were the only tools a man needed to do an honest job. Morrison rented a small room above Henley's general store rather than living near the cemetery, and he established a routine of arriving each morning at 7 o'clock sharp, tool bag in hand, whistling hymns as he walked up the hill to St. Margaret's. For 2 weeks it seemed as though Morrison's no-nonsense attitude had broken whatever spell of misfortune had claimed his predecessor. The townspeople began to relax, attributing Ezra's death to nothing more than the tragic coincidence of an aging man pushing himself too hard in difficult conditions. The illusion of normalcy shattered completely on the morning of November 8, 1904, when Martha Morrison arrived at the cemetery looking for her husband, who hadn't returned to his room the previous evening. What she found there defied every rational explanation that the human mind could conjure. Samuel Morrison lay at the bottom of a freshly dug grave, positioned in an almost identical manner to Ezra Thompson. Face down, arms extended toward his spade, features frozen in an expression of mortal terror. According to Dr. Webb's medical examination notes, discovered in 1987 during the renovation of the old Millbrook Medical Clinic, Morrison's body showed no signs of violence, no wounds or trauma that could account for his death. The grave itself presented the same impossible characteristics as Ezra's final resting place. Perfectly straight walls, precise measurements, corners cut with geometric accuracy that would have challenged even the most experienced stonemason. Most disturbing of all, the amount of earth that had been moved suggested Morrison had been working for at least 8 hours straight, yet multiple witnesses had seen him leaving the cemetery in apparent good health just after sunset the evening before. Dr. Harrison Webb, who had been troubled by questions surrounding Ezra Thompson's death, now found himself facing a pattern that chilled him to the bone. In his private journal entry, dated November 9, 1904, pages that wouldn't see daylight for over 80 years, Webb wrote of his growing conviction that something beyond medical explanation was at work in Millbrook Cemetery. He noted the uncanny similarities between the two deaths, both men found in graves of identical dimensions, both positioned in the same unnatural pose, both bearing expressions that suggested they'd seen something so terrifying that their hearts had simply stopped beating. The doctor's clinical training demanded rational explanations, but the evidence before him seemed to mock the very foundations of scientific understanding. As Webb locked his journal away that November evening, recording his intention to monitor the cemetery more closely, he had no way of knowing that within 2 weeks, a third gravedigger would be found dead under circumstances so bizarre that they would force him to question everything he believed about life, death, and the thin boundary that separates the natural world from something far more sinister. Dr. Harrison Webb had earned his medical degree from Harvard University in 1888, making him one of the most educated men for 100 miles in any direction from Millbrook. His credentials, preserved in the Harvard Medical School alumni records, showed a distinguished academic career, followed by 2 years of surgical training at Massachusetts General Hospital before he'd made the surprising decision to practice in rural Vermont. At 38, Webb possessed the kind of methodical scientific mind that had been shaped by the rapid advances in medical understanding that characterized the turn of the century. He'd witnessed the emergence of germ theory, the development of antiseptic surgery, and the early applications of X-ray technology. His medical practice in Millbrook, documented in patient ledgers now housed at the Rutland County Medical Society, served 4 townships and included everything from delivering babies to performing emergency amputations. But nothing in his extensive training had prepared him for the impossibilities he was witnessing in St. Margaret's Cemetery. Webb's reputation for thorough logical analysis had made him the unofficial coroner for the region, and it was this role that gave him unprecedented access to examine the circumstances surrounding these inexplicable deaths. The third death occurred on November 22, 1904, claiming James Whitfield, a 28-year-old laborer who'd traveled from Burlington specifically to take the gravedigger position after hearing about the job through a newspaper advertisement. According to the Burlington Free Press Employment section, archived at the Vermont Historical Society, Whitfield had been described as strong as an ox and twice as stubborn, a man who'd worked construction on the new railroad bridges spanning Lake Champlain without showing the slightest fear of heights or dangerous conditions. Whitfield had openly mocked the stories about his predecessor's fates, telling the proprietor of Henley's General Store that he'd dig graves in hell itself if the pay was fair and steady. His confidence had reassured the increasingly nervous townspeople, and for 8 days Whitfield had worked without incident, completing 3 burials and beginning excavation work for the winter season ahead. Dr. Webb had made a point of observing Whitfield's work from a distance, noting the man's robust health and professional competence in his detailed case notes, which documented everything from the gravedigger's physical condition to his mental state and working methods. When Whitfield's body was discovered on the morning of November 23rd by Pastor Jonathan Mills during his routine walk to morning prayers, Dr. Webb was summoned immediately to conduct what had now become a grimly familiar examination. The scene that greeted him was so precisely identical to the previous two deaths that Webb later wrote it felt like observing the same nightmare repeated with mechanical precision. Whitfield lay face down in a perfectly excavated grave, his powerful frame contorted in the same position of reaching toward his spade, his face bearing that same expression of unspeakable terror that had marked his predecessors. Webb's medical examination, recorded in meticulous detail in his private notes, revealed the same absence of trauma, the same inexplicable cardiac arrest in an otherwise healthy man, the same impossible circumstances that defied rational explanation. What truly alarmed Webb, however, were the physical impossibilities he was beginning to document. The graves were being dug with a level of precision that would have required surveying equipment and multiple workers, yet all three men had been working alone, and the amount of earth moved suggested superhuman endurance that no normal person could have sustained. Armed with his medical training and a growing determination to understand what was happening in his community, Dr. Webb began conducting what he privately termed scientific observations of the cemetery during nighttime hours. His journal entries from late November 1904 describe a systematic approach to gathering evidence, including temperature readings, soil analysis, and careful documentation of any unusual phenomena he could observe. Webb enlisted the help of Thomas Hartwell, the blacksmith's son, and one of the few locals brave enough to assist with nighttime surveillance, to help him monitor the cemetery from concealed positions around the perimeter. Their observations, recorded in Webb's cipher-coded notes to prevent accidental discovery by nervous townspeople, documented strange temperature fluctuations that had no meteorological explanation, soil disturbances that appeared overnight in areas where no one had been working, and most disturbing of all, sounds that Webb described as excavation work being conducted by something that understands neither fatigue nor the limitations of human anatomy. As Webb concluded his November 30th journal entry with plans to intensify his investigation, he noted with growing unease that the next full moon would occur on December 7th, and he had begun to suspect that the timing of these deaths was following a pattern that had nothing to do with coincidence. Dr. Webb's investigation took a dramatic turn on December 3, 1904, when he made a discovery that would fundamentally alter his understanding of what was happening in Millbrook. While conducting research in the basement archives of St. Margaret's Church, searching for historical records that might explain the cemetery's unusual characteristics, Webb uncovered a collection of documents that had been deliberately concealed behind a false wall in the foundation. According to his journal entry dated December 4th, these papers included the original land surveys from 1798, correspondence between the first settlers and territorial authorities, and most significantly, a leather-bound diary belonging to Reverend Josiah Blackwood, the church's founding pastor. The diary, written in a cramped, urgent hand that suggested its author was deeply troubled, contained entries spanning from 1799 to 1823, documenting what Blackwood described as spiritual disturbances of the most severe nature that had plagued the cemetery almost from its inception. Webb's translation of Blackwood's archaic prose, preserved in his own meticulous notes, revealed that the current location of St. Margaret's Cemetery had been built directly over what the local Abenaki tribe had considered sacred burial grounds, used for their spiritual practices for countless generations before European settlement. The most disturbing revelations came from Blackwood's detailed correspondence with tribal elder Joseph Sokoki, whose letters were preserved alongside the diary in oiled cloth wrapping that had protected them from moisture and decay. These documents, translated from a mixture of English and Abenaki phrases, described what Sokoki termed the anger of those who guard the threshold between the living and the dead. According to these letters, dated between 1802 and 1819, the Abenaki had warned Blackwood that building a Christian cemetery on their sacred ground would awaken the watchers who ensure that the dead remain in their proper place. Sokoki's correspondence grew increasingly urgent over the years, documenting incidents that bore striking similarities to what Webb was observing a century later. Gravediggers dying under mysterious circumstances, tools moving on their own during nighttime hours, and earth that seemed to resist the violation of its sacred nature. Most chilling of all was Sokoke's final letter, dated March 15, 1823, which warned that the spirits grow stronger with each desecration, and the day will come when they will claim not just those who disturb the earth, but all who profit from its violation. Webb's analysis of Blackwood's diary revealed a pattern of deaths and disappearances that had been systematically covered up by church and civil authorities for over 80 years. The Reverend's entries documented at least 12 gravediggers who had died under circumstances identical to what Webb was witnessing, always found in perfectly excavated graves, always bearing expressions of mortal terror, always during periods when the spiritual disturbances seemed to intensify. Blackwood had attempted various solutions over his 24 years of ministry, including blessing ceremonies, exorcism rituals, and even temporary relocations of the cemetery. But nothing had provided lasting relief from what he termed the guardian's wrath. The diary's final entries, written in an increasingly shaky hand, described Blackwood's growing conviction that the only solution would be to abandon the site entirely and return the land to its original sacred purpose. According to town records housed in the Vermont State Archives, Reverend Blackwood disappeared on October 31, 1823, during what he had planned as a final attempt to negotiate peace with the spiritual forces plaguing his congregation. His body was never found, but Webb noted with a chill that the date of Blackwood's disappearance fell on the same night of the year that all 3 recent gravedigger deaths had occurred. The implications of these historical discoveries sent Webb into a crisis of scientific faith that he documented with painful honesty in his December entries. Here was a Harvard-trained physician, a man of science and reason, confronted with evidence that suggested forces beyond medical understanding were at work in his community. Webb's training demanded that he seek rational explanations for the phenomena he was observing, yet the historical pattern documented in Blackwood's diary stretched back over multiple generations and showed no signs of natural causation. The doctor's notes from this period reveal a man struggling to reconcile his scientific worldview with mounting evidence that seemed to point towards supernatural intervention. As Webb concluded his December 7th journal entry, he noted with growing dread that the pattern of deaths was accelerating, and based on Blackwood's historical records, the spiritual disturbances typically intensified during the winter months when the barrier between the living and dead grew thinnest. What Webb didn't yet realize was that his investigation had not gone unnoticed by the forces he was attempting to understand, and that his scientific curiosity was about to make him a target of the very phenomena he was studying. The 4th gravedigger arrived in Millbrook on December 10, 1904, despite the growing reputation of the position as cursed. Michael O'Brien, a 35-year-old Irish immigrant from Boston's North End, had been recruited through a Catholic charity organization that helped find work for recent arrivals to New England. According to immigration records preserved at Ellis Island, O'Brien had arrived in America just 8 months earlier with nothing but the clothes on his back and a determination to build a better life for his family back in County Cork. The job advertisement, placed by the increasingly desperate Millbrook Town Council in the Boston Irish Herald, had promised steady wages and housing, but made no mention of the mysterious deaths that had plagued previous gravediggers. O'Brien's letters home, later discovered among his personal effects and translated from Gaelic by scholars at Boston College, revealed a man who was deeply religious but practical, dismissing the locals' warnings about supernatural dangers as Protestant superstitions that held no power over a man protected by his Catholic faith. His confidence in divine protection, combined with his desperate need for steady employment, made him immune to the fears that were keeping other potential gravediggers away from Millbrook. Dr. Webb had been monitoring the cemetery with increasing intensity since his discoveries in the church archives, and he convinced O'Brien to allow him to observe the gravedigger's work during daylight hours under the pretense of a medical study on the effects of manual labor in cold weather conditions. Webb's detailed observations, recorded in his encrypted journal pages, documented O'Brien's robust health, professional competence, and unwavering religious devotion. The Irishman would cross himself before beginning each grave and mutter prayers in Gaelic throughout his work. For 6 days, O'Brien completed his duties without incident, even expressing satisfaction to Webb about the honest work he was doing and his plans to bring his wife and 3 children to America once he'd saved enough money. Webb noted that O'Brien's presence seemed to have a calming effect on the cemetery's atmosphere. The strange temperature fluctuations he'd been documenting decreased, and the unnatural sounds he'd been hearing during nighttime surveillance became less frequent. This temporary respite gave Webb hope that perhaps the cycle of deaths had been broken, but his optimism would prove tragically premature. The morning of December 17, 1904, brought the most disturbing discovery yet in the escalating series of Gravedigger deaths. O'Brien's body was found by Dr. Webb himself during his regular dawn observation of the cemetery, but what he discovered defied even his expanded understanding of the supernatural forces at work in Millbrook. The Irishman lay not in a single grave, but sprawled across 3 partially excavated burial sites, as if he'd been frantically digging multiple graves simultaneously during the night. Webb's medical examination, documented in his most detailed autopsy notes, revealed evidence that O'Brien had been working with inhuman endurance for at least 10 hours straight, moving an amount of earth that would have challenged a team of experienced laborers. Most shocking of all, O'Brien's hands were worn down to the bone from digging. He had apparently continued working long after his spade had broken and his gloves had disintegrated, using his bare hands to claw at the frozen ground until his fingers were reduced to bloody stumps. Yet, despite these horrific injuries, O'Brien's face bore the same expression of absolute terror that had marked his predecessors, suggesting that whatever had compelled him to dig with such desperate intensity had been even more frightening than his own mutilation. The 5th death came just 9 days later, on December 26th, claiming Peter Larsen, a Norwegian immigrant who had volunteered for the position despite his wife's desperate pleas that he decline the job. Larsen, a veteran of railway construction who had helped build the Transcontinental Railroad across the American West, possessed the kind of physical strength and mental toughness that came from surviving some of the most dangerous work available in America. According to his employment records from the Central Pacific Railway Company, archived at the California State Railroad Museum, Larsen had worked in conditions that had killed scores of other men, blasting through solid granite in the Sierra Nevada mountains, laying track across Death Valley in summer heat that regularly exceeded 120 degrees, surviving avalanches and Indian attacks that had decimated entire work crews. His decision to take the Gravedigger position was motivated by a desire to settle down with his family in a peaceful community, and he had dismissed the stories about supernatural dangers as the kind of folklore that immigrants often used to explain things they didn't understand about their new country. Webb's pre-employment medical examination had found Larsen to be in exceptional physical condition, with the kind of muscular development and cardiovascular fitness that marked him as one of the strongest men in the region. What happened to Peter Larsen on the night of December 26th would provide Dr. Webb with the most conclusive evidence yet, that the forces claiming these men operated beyond any natural law or human understanding, and would finally convince him that his scientific approach to the mystery was not just inadequate, but potentially deadly to anyone who dared to investigate too deeply. The discovery of Peter Larsen's body on the morning of December 27, 1904, marked a turning point that would force Dr. Webb to abandon his scientific methodology in favor of approaches that his Harvard training had never prepared him to consider. Larsen had been found in circumstances that defied not just medical explanation, but the very laws of physics as Webb understood them. The Norwegian's massive frame, 6 feet 4 inches of railroad-hardened muscle, had been discovered at the bottom of a grave that measured exactly 12 feet deep, despite the fact that the frozen December ground should have been impenetrable more than 3 feet down. According to Webb's measurements, recorded in his increasingly frantic journal entries, the walls of Larsen's grave were carved with geometric precision into the bedrock itself, displaying tool marks that suggested the use of industrial mining equipment rather than the simple spades and picks available to a lone gravedigger. Most impossibly, Larsen's body showed evidence of having fallen from a great height, with compound fractures and internal injuries consistent with a drop of at least 30 feet, yet the grave showed no signs of collapse or structural failure that could account for such trauma. Webb's medical examination revealed that Larson had died not from cardiac arrest like his predecessors, but from injuries sustained during what appeared to be a violent struggle with an unseen force of incredible strength. Recognizing that conventional medicine and scientific observation had proven inadequate to address the crisis facing Millbrook, Dr. Webb made a decision that would have scandalized his former colleagues at Harvard. He sought the assistance of Joseph Sokoke's grandson, a man known locally as Samuel Nightwalker. According to tribal records preserved by the Abenaki Nation, Nightwalker served as a spiritual intermediary between his people and the white settlements that had spread across their ancestral lands, and he possessed knowledge of traditional ceremonies that his grandfather had passed down through generations of oral history. Webb's initial contact with Nightwalker, documented in a letter dated December 29, 1904, revealed the doctor's desperation as he abandoned his scientific skepticism in favor of indigenous wisdom that offered the only hope of understanding the supernatural forces plaguing his community. Nightwalker's response, preserved in Webb's private papers, confirmed the doctor's worst fears. The Gravedigger deaths were indeed the work of spiritual guardians who had been awakened by decades of desecration to their sacred burial grounds, and these entities were growing stronger with each death, feeding on the terror and spiritual energy of their victims. The collaboration between Dr. Webb and Samuel Nightwalker began in early January 1905, as the two men worked to develop a ceremonial approach that might appease the angry spirits and end the cycle of deaths that had claimed 5 gravediggers in less than 3 months. Nightwalker's examination of the cemetery, conducted according to traditional Abenaki spiritual practices, revealed what he described as a wound in the earth that grows deeper with each violation. According to his assessment, documented in Webb's coded journal entries, the Christian burials conducted over the past century had not just displaced the indigenous spiritual presence, but had actively corrupted the sacred nature of the site, creating what Nightwalker termed a feeding ground for entities that should have remained dormant. The solution would require a complex purification ceremony that would need to be performed during the new moon of January 1905, but Nightwalker warned Webb that the ritual carried significant risks. Any interruption or mistake during the ceremony could result in the spiritual entities becoming permanently awakened and vastly more dangerous than they already were. As Webb prepared for what he hoped would be a definitive solution to Millbrook's supernatural crisis, he was unaware that the town council had already hired a 6th gravedigger, a decision that would lead to the most horrific death yet and nearly derail any hope of ending the cycle of violence. The 6th gravedigger, William Hayes, arrived in Millbrook on January 8, 1905, just 3 days before the scheduled purification ceremony. Hayes was a former Union Army veteran who'd survived the Battle of Gettysburg and the Siege of Petersburg, experiences that had left him with what modern medicine would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress, but which he simply called soldier's nerves. According to his military service records, housed at the National Archives, Hayes had been awarded the Medal of Honor for single-handedly holding a position against Confederate forces for 6 hours, despite being wounded 3 times, and his psychological profile suggested a man who had become comfortable with death and violence in ways that made him uniquely unsuited to recognize supernatural danger. Webb's attempts to warn Hayes about the cemetery's dangers fell on deaf ears. The veteran dismissed the stories about supernatural deaths as ghost tales meant to scare children, and he expressed confidence that his military experience had prepared him to handle any challenge that a civilian graveyard could present. What Hayes couldn't have known was that his arrival had coincided with the strongest manifestation yet of the spiritual forces that guarded the cemetery, and that his death would provide Dr. Webb with the most terrifying evidence yet that some forces are beyond human understanding or control. William Hayes survived exactly 2 nights in his position as Millbrook's gravedigger before becoming the 6th victim of forces that seemed to grow more violent with each death. His body was discovered on the morning of January 11, 1905, in circumstances so horrific that Dr. Webb's medical notes, written in his steadiest handwriting to maintain clinical objectivity, still conveyed a sense of barely controlled terror. Hayes had been found not in a grave, but suspended 15 feet above the cemetery ground, his body impaled on the iron spires of the cemetery's decorative fence, with such force that the metal had penetrated completely through his torso. According to Webb's examination, the veteran's positioning defied every law of physics. There was no elevated platform from which he could have fallen, no evidence of machinery that could have lifted his considerable weight, and the angle of the wound suggested he had been thrown upward with tremendous force before being brought down onto the fence spikes. Most disturbing of all, Hayes's military-issued pocket watch had stopped at exactly 3:17 a.m., the same time recorded on the timepieces of all 5 previous victims, suggesting that whatever force was claiming these men operated according to a supernatural schedule that had nothing to do with earthly timekeeping. Webb's notes from that morning reveal a man pushed to the breaking point of sanity, writing with shaking hands that the laws of nature themselves seem suspended in this accursed place. The purification ceremony conducted by Samuel Nightwalker began at sunset on January 12, 1905, just 24 hours after Hayes's death had provided the final proof that conventional approaches to the crisis were not only inadequate, but potentially suicidal. Webb's detailed documentation of the ritual, written in a cipher code that wouldn't be cracked until the 1960s, described a complex ceremony involving the burning of sacred herbs, the recitation of prayers in the Abenaki language, and the careful placement of consecrated stones at specific points around the cemetery perimeter. Nightwalker had warned Webb that the ceremony would likely provoke a final violent response from the spiritual guardians as they fought against being returned to dormancy, and the doctor's notes record temperature drops of over 40 degrees within minutes, earth tremors that had no seismic explanation, and sounds that he described as the voices of the dead rising in anger against the living. The most terrifying moment came at midnight, when Nightwalker's prayers seemed to awaken every spirit that had been disturbed by a century of Christian burials. Webb wrote of seeing translucent figures rising from the graves, of hearing the screams of every person who had ever been buried in the desecrated ground, and of feeling what he could only describe as the attention of something so ancient and powerful that human consciousness could barely comprehend its nature. The ceremony reached its climax in the early hours of January 13th, when Nightwalker's final prayers appeared to succeed in appeasing the angry spirits and returning them to their proper rest. Webb's notes record that the supernatural manifestations ceased as suddenly as they had begun, leaving behind a cemetery that felt fundamentally different, peaceful in a way that it hadn't been since his investigation began. The temperature returned to normal winter levels. The unnatural sounds that had plagued the area for months disappeared entirely. And most significantly, the sense of malevolent presence that had made the cemetery feel like a wound in the world seemed to heal itself. Nightwalker's assessment, recorded in Webb's journal, was that the spirits had accepted the apology offered on behalf of the white settlement and had agreed to return to dormancy, but he warned that this peace would last only as long as the cemetery was treated with proper respect and the indigenous nature of the site was acknowledged. The immediate test of the ceremony's success came when a local man died of natural causes 3 days later. For the first time in over a century, a grave was dug in St. Margaret's Cemetery without incident, and the temporary gravedigger who performed the work reported no unusual experiences or supernatural encounters. The resolution of Millbrook's supernatural crisis might have become a celebrated example of cross-cultural cooperation and spiritual healing, but the intervention of state authorities ensured that the truth would remain buried for decades. On January 20, 1905, representatives from the Vermont state government arrived in Millbrook with orders to investigate the series of industrial accidents that had claimed 6 gravediggers in less than 4 months. According to confidential state documents discovered in 1978 during a routine archive reorganization, these officials had been dispatched not to uncover the truth, but to ensure that rumors about supernatural events didn't damage Vermont's reputation as a safe, rational place for business investment and tourism development. Dr. Webb was ordered to surrender all medical records related to the deaths, and his private journals were confiscated under authority of a state health emergency declaration that classified his notes as potentially harmful to public welfare. Samuel Nightwalker was arrested on charges of practicing medicine without a license and conducting unauthorized religious ceremonies on public property, charges that resulted in his imprisonment for 6 months and effectively silenced the only witness who could corroborate Webb's account of the supernatural events. The official state report, published in the Burlington Free Press on February 15, 1905, attributed all 6 deaths to a combination of harsh winter working conditions, inadequate safety procedures, and the psychological stress associated with cemetery work, and recommended improved training and equipment for future gravediggers. What the report didn't mention was that no gravedigger would hold the position at St. Margaret's Cemetery for more than a few weeks at a time for the next 50 years. As word of the site's dangers spread through informal networks despite official attempts at suppression, the case of Millbrook's gravediggers forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of reality itself. Dr. Harrison Webb, a man trained in the most advanced medical science of his era, was ultimately forced to abandon everything he'd been taught about the natural world in order to understand what was happening in his community. His transformation from skeptical scientist to reluctant believer in supernatural forces represents more than just one man's crisis of faith. It reflects the limitations of human knowledge when confronted with phenomena that operate beyond our understanding. The fates of those involved in the Millbrook incident reveal the lasting cost of encountering forces beyond human comprehension. Dr. Webb never practiced medicine again after his journals were confiscated by state authorities. He spent his remaining years as a recluse, dying in 1932 with his reputation destroyed and his groundbreaking documentation lost to official suppression. Samuel Nightwalker served his 6-month prison sentence in silence, but tribal records suggest he spent the rest of his life warning other indigenous communities about the dangers of spiritual desecration. The gravediggers themselves, Ezra Thompson, Samuel Morrison, James Whitfield, Michael O'Brien, Peter Larson, and William Hayes, became footnotes in official records, their true stories buried beneath layers of bureaucratic lies designed to protect a comfortable fiction about the nature of reality. Perhaps most disturbing is the lasting impact on Millbrook itself. The community never fully recovered from those 4 months of terror in 1904-1905. Families moved away, businesses closed, and property values plummeted as word of the supernatural events spread despite official denials. St. Margaret's Cemetery still operates today, but no gravedigger has ever held the position for more than a few weeks at a time. Local residents speak in whispers about feeling watched near the cemetery, about tools that move on their own, about the sound of digging that can be heard on certain winter nights when the wind is still. The Abenaki spiritual sites that were desecrated to build the cemetery remain unrecognized by official authorities, an ongoing violation that some believe keeps the door open for future supernatural manifestations. The Millbrook case raises profound questions about the relationship between indigenous wisdom and modern scientific understanding. How many other industrial accidents and medical mysteries throughout American history might actually be the result of spiritual forces that we lack the cultural framework to recognize? How many times have ancient warnings been dismissed as primitive superstition, only to result in tragedies that could have been prevented through respect for indigenous knowledge? The suppression of Dr. Webb's evidence suggests that powerful institutions have a vested interest in maintaining the illusion that such phenomena don't exist, but at what cost to the communities that must live with the consequences? The most chilling aspect of the Millbrook mystery is what remains unresolved. Samuel Nightwalker's ceremony appeared to appease the spiritual guardians, but his warnings suggest that this peace is conditional on continued respect for the sacred nature of the site. What happens when that respect fails? What happens when developers decide the land is too valuable to leave undisturbed, or when a new generation of officials decides that old agreements don't matter? The brief period of stability that followed the 1905 ceremony may be nothing more than a temporary truce in a conflict that stretches back centuries and forward into an uncertain future. What do you think? Are there forces in this world that science still can't explain? Have you ever experienced something that made you question the boundaries between the natural and supernatural? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't be afraid to tell us about your own encounters with the unexplained. If this story opened your mind to possibilities you hadn't considered before, hit that like button to help others discover these hidden chapters of American history. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on, because we're just getting started with cases that challenge everything you thought you knew about reality. Share this video with someone who's ready to question the official version of events, and remember, the truth is often stranger and more terrifying than any fiction. Next week, we're diving into another case that authorities tried to bury, the 1897 incident in Colorado, where an entire mining crew disappeared underground, leaving behind evidence that suggests they encountered something that had been waiting in the darkness for thousands of years. You won't want to miss it.